Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. Your job is simple. Listen. Let the language wash over you. You don't need to understand every word. Just stay with the conversation, follow the ideas, and let your English do what it's designed to do: absorb. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Imagine a future where, like, a neuroscientist can perfectly map your brain. And I mean perfectly.
Right, down to the atomic level.
Exactly, down to the atomic level. They know every single electrical spark, every rush of dopamine, every firing synapse. They can watch a monitor and tell exactly when you're feeling physical pain or, when you're tasting something sweet. But here's the catch.
There's always a catch.
Yeah. Despite having a complete, flawless map of your biology, that scientist still cannot answer one simple question.
Which is?
What does that pain or that sweetness actually feel like to you?
Oh, wow.
Right. Welcome to our deep dive.
It is, it's the ultimate blind spot. I mean, we live in an era that celebrates the absolute triumph of empirical science, and rightly so.
Sure.
The volume of data we can collect about the physical universe is just staggering. But that triumph has bred a very common modern assumption that we really need to address head on today.
Right. It's an assumption I hear constantly, and if I'm being completely honest, it's one I've caught myself believing.
Oh, same here.
The thought goes something like this. Hasn't science basically made philosophy obsolete?
Yeah, that's the big one.
Like, if we have physics to explain the cosmos, biology to explain life, and psychology to explain human behavior, what is actually left for a philosopher to do?
Right. Aren't they just, sitting around in tweed jackets overthinking things that science has already solved?
Exactly. It's an incredibly popular sentiment.
It is, but it rests on a fundamental conceptual confusion. Science hasn't superseded philosophy. It never could.
Okay.
What science does is answer some of the specific empirical questions that philosophy originally raised centuries ago. But in doing so, science constantly generates entirely new philosophical questions.
I see.
Yeah, questions that the scientific method, by its very design, is completely incapable of resolving.
So the mission of our deep dive today is to trace the 2,500-year evolution of Western philosophy to show you, our listener, exactly why that is.
Yes. Philosophy is not a dead, archaic hobby. It is the essential meta-discipline.
The operating system running underneath everything else.
Exactly.
And for you listening, whether you're trying to figure out the right way to navigate a moral dilemma, or how to construct an airtight argument at work, or just, trying to make sense of a modern world that feels like it's spinning out of control.
Which it often does.
Yeah. Understanding this philosophical roadmap is the ultimate shortcut. We're taking you on a massive tour of human thought.
But before we get to the ancient Greeks, let's unpack this core idea.
Right. Where exactly does science hit a wall? Because to a lot of people, the scientific method seems invincible.
It seems invincible until you examine its foundations. Let's look at it field by field. Take epistemology.
Which is the study of knowledge, right?
Right. The study of knowledge and what makes a logical inference valid. You cannot answer the question of what constitutes a valid inference by running a laboratory experiment.
Wait, why not? Couldn't you, test different ways of thinking and see which one gets the right result?
Well, no, because the very act of designing an experiment, deciding what variables to control, and interpreting the data, it presupposes that you already have a philosophical theory of valid inference.
Oh.
Yeah, you're relying on a philosophical framework just to conduct the science in the first place. You can't use the scientific method to prove the validity of the scientific method. That's a circular argument.
Oh, wow. Okay. It's like trying to use a ruler to measure whether the ruler itself is a foot long.
A perfect analogy.
You have to assume the ruler is accurate before you start measuring.
Exactly. Or consider ethics. Neuroscience is making incredible strides, right? We can put someone in an fMRI machine, present them with a difficult moral dilemma, and watch exactly which networks in their brain activate.
Right, you can see the brain lighting up.
Science can describe, in granular detail, the biological mechanism of how a moral judgment is formed. But neuroscience is entirely mute on the question of whether that judgment is actually correct.
Because seeing that my prefrontal cortex is lighting up when I decide to I don't know, lie to protect a friend's secret. That doesn't tell me if lying was the morally right thing to do.
Exactly. It just tells you the machine is working.
Yeah.
Or look at mathematics, the most rigorous discipline we have. Math is perfectly logically sound, but math cannot explain its own existence.
What do you mean?
Where exactly does the number 2 exist? Have you ever tripped over a physical 2 in the street?
No. I mean, I've seen 2 apples or 2 cars, but not the abstract concept itself.
Right. And more profoundly, why do these purely abstract mental structures that mathematicians dream up correspond so flawlessly to the physical reality of the universe?
Oh, that's a wild thought.
Mathematics doesn't answer that. Philosophy steps in to address those foundational meta-level questions that are left hanging after empirical inquiry has done everything it can possibly do.
Okay, I'm picturing it like the science is like fully understanding a car. We know the combustion rate of the engine, the torque, the aerodynamics, and exactly how fast the vehicle can go.
We've mastered the machine. Yeah, we've mastered it. But philosophy is the process of figuring out where we should actually drive the car.
Yes.
And what the rules of the road ought to be, and whether the road trip is even worth taking in the first place. That is a highly functional way to look at it. And nowhere is that limitation clearer than in the scenario you brought up at the very beginning, the hard problem of consciousness.
Right.
We can map the physical processes of the brain endlessly, but no matter how detailed that biological map gets, a map of synapses firing does not and cannot explain why those physical processes produce a subjective inner experience.
Right. Why does a specific chemical reaction in my tongue and a neural firing pattern in my brain actually feel like the bitter taste of black coffee?
Exactly.
Or the vivid emotional redness of a sunset? Science gives us the mechanism of the physical event, but it doesn't give us the subjective experience of the event.
And that gap between the physical and the mental, between the eyes and the odd, that is the territory of philosophy. Which brings us to the thinkers who first dared to map this territory.
The ancient Greeks.
Yes. The mathematician Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato.
Which, to a modern ear, sounds like a massive exaggeration. Like, how can everything we've thought of in the last 2 millennia be a footnote to one guy?
I mean, it is an overstatement designed to make a point, but it captures a profound truth. Plato articulated the agenda.
He laid the groundwork.
He formulated the core questions that still consume us. What is the nature of reality? What is justice? What constitutes a good life? What is the relationship between the mind and the body?
He laid all of this out 25 centuries ago.
Yeah, and we are largely still arguing within the parameters he established.
But wait, how did he even know to ask those questions? Humans had been around for a long time before Plato. Did people just wake up in Greece one day and decide to invent philosophy?
Well, no. To understand Plato, you have to understand the radical shift that occurred just before him. You have to rewind the tape to the 6th century BCE.
To the pre-Socratics.
Yes, the intellectual ancestors of both modern science and philosophy. Thinkers like Thales and Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Parmenides.
Okay.
Before this group emerged, the explanations for the world were entirely supernatural and mythic. If you wanted to know why it rained, why there was an earthquake, or why crops failed, the answer was always that the gods were angry, or the gods were pleased.
It was just a world run by divine whim.
Precisely. The pre-Socratics represent the first systematic attempt in Western intellectual history to explain the world through natural causes.
Without resorting to mythology.
Right. Thales, for instance, hypothesized that the fundamental substance of all matter was water.
Which is empirically wrong, obviously.
Very wrong. But the methodology was revolutionary. By claiming everything was water, Thales was proposing that the chaotic diversity of the world could be reduced to a single underlying natural principle.
Oh, I see. He replaced myth with theory.
He did. They were basically the first theoretical physicists. They were asking cosmological questions.
Like, is change real, like Heraclitus claimed when he said you can't step in the same river twice?
Yes, or is change an illusion, as Parmenides argued. They were obsessed with the universe.
But then Socrates comes onto the scene, and he executes this massive, whiplash-inducing pivot.
He completely changes the subject. Socrates, whose ideas we primarily know through the dialogues written by his student Plato, looked at all these cosmological debates about water and fire and the universe and essentially said,
What did he say?
He said, this is all very interesting, but it doesn't tell me how I ought to live. Socrates shifted the focus from the cosmos to human character, ethics, and epistemology.
And he did this using his infamous Socratic method, the Elenchus. I have to say, reading about this, it sounds absolutely exhausting to be on the receiving end of.
Oh, he was a highly polarizing figure in Athens. I mean,
Yeah.
it eventually cost him his life.
Right.
The Socratic method wasn't about Socrates giving lectures. It was a grueling process of interrogation. He would find someone who claimed to be an expert, say, a famous general who claimed to know exactly what courage is, or a politician who claimed to understand justice.
And he'd ask them for a definition.
Yes.
And then the trap closes.
Exactly. The general might say, courage is never retreating in battle. And Socrates would gently ask, but what if retreating is a tactical feint to draw the enemy into an ambush? Is that cowardice?
And the general would have to amend his definition.
Socrates would subject the claim to relentless question and counter-question until the expert's definition collapsed into contradictions. He exposed that they didn't actually know what they claimed to know.
It's an intellectual teardown. And the punchline of all this relentless questioning is Socrates' radical conclusion that his own wisdom consisted solely in knowing what he did not know.
Right.
Today, that sounds like a motivational poster, but at the time, that was a conceptual earthquake.
It's an incredibly demanding epistemic position. To truly adopt that mindset isn't just about feigning humility.
No, it's active.
It requires systematically suspending the very confidence and assumptions that normally sustain our daily actions and our social identities. It strips away unearned certainty, leaving you with a blank foundation.
And from that stripped-down Socratic foundation, his student Plato steps up to build a massive systematic philosophy. This is where we get the big ideas that shaped everything.
Yes.
Plato wants to know how we can have genuine knowledge if the physical world is constantly changing and decaying. And his answer is the theory of forms.
The theory of forms is Plato's ambitious attempt to solve both the metaphysical question of what is real and the epistemological question of how we know it.
Okay, unpack that.
He argued that this physical world we inhabit, the world we see and touch, is not the ultimate reality. It is merely a flawed, impermanent shadow of a higher unseen realm. A realm composed of abstract, perfect, eternal entities, which he called the forms.
Okay, let's ground this for you listening. If I try to draw a circle on a piece of white paper, it's never going to be a true perfect circle.
Never.
The ink might bleed slightly into the fibers, my hand might microshake, the paper isn't perfectly flat, but the concept of a perfect mathematical circle exists.
Yes, and Plato would argue that the perfect circle doesn't just exist as a useful fiction in your head. It has a real, objective existence in the realm of forms.
So every physical circle you draw is just a temporary, flawed participant in the eternal form of the circle.
Exactly. And Plato extended this far beyond geometry.
Right. He applied it to everything. There's a perfect form of a tree, a perfect form of a dog. But most importantly, he applied it to abstract concepts.
Yes.
There's a perfect form of justice, a perfect form of beauty, and above all, the form of the good.
And understanding that hierarchy is critical to understanding Plato's political philosophy, particularly in his masterwork, The Republic.
Right, because if true justice only exists in the abstract realm of forms, then how do we build a just society down here in the physical world?
Plato argued that society cannot be ruled by the masses because the masses are distracted by the messy physical shadows. Society requires philosopher kings.
Rulers who have been subjected to decades of intense intellectual and moral education until they are capable of perceiving these perfect forms directly.
Exactly. Because only someone who knows what the pure form of justice is can possibly enact just laws.
He creates a comprehensive system. He maps out the nature of the soul, he explores the nature of love and desire in dialogues like the Symposium, and he argues for the immortality of the soul in the Phaedo.
It is a soaring, abstract architecture of thought.
It's beautiful, but it's also deeply detached from the mud and dirt of everyday life, which is exactly what his most famous student, Aristotle, realized.
Yes, the great shift.
Aristotle spends years studying under Plato, learns the entire system, and then essentially says, I respect you, but this is entirely backwards.
Aristotle's departure from Plato is one of the most consequential intellectual splits in human history. While Plato pointed upwards to the abstract realm of forms as the source of reality, Aristotle pointed downwards, back to the earth.
He brought it all back down.
He rejected the idea of a separate realm. For him, reality is located squarely within the particular individual physical things of this world.
Okay, let me try a visual analogy to see if I had the distinction right.
Go for it.
Plato thinks that the perfect architect's blueprint is the true reality, and the physical house we actually live in, with its squeaky floorboards and peeling paint, is just a dirty, flawed copy.
Right.
But Aristotle walks onto the construction site, kicks a brick, and says, no, the physical house is the reality. The form of the house doesn't exist in some magical blueprint realm. The form only exists in the bricks and the mortar.
That is an excellent way to visualize his concept of form and matter, or hylomorphism. For Aristotle, you cannot separate the form from the substance.
Oh, I see.
And because of this profound shift in perspective, Aristotle's methodology was radically different from Plato's. If reality is here in the physical world, then the way to understand reality is to observe the physical world meticulously.
Which explains why Aristotle was a voracious categorizer. He wasn't just sitting in a chair thinking. He was out dissecting marine animals, classifying biology, observing weather patterns.
He essentially laid the empirical groundwork for physics, zoology, logic, rhetoric, and aesthetics. He was attempting to map the entirety of human knowledge.
That's wild. But perhaps his most enduring legacy for the modern reader is his approach to ethics, specifically found in the Nicomachean Ethics.
Yes. Just as he grounded reality in the physical world, he grounded human morality in practical human nature. He introduced the central concept of eudaimonia.
Which is usually translated as happiness, but that feels a bit flimsy, doesn't it? Like, eating a donut makes me happy, but I don't think that's what Aristotle meant.
You're right, happiness is a notoriously poor translation. Flourishing is much more accurate.
Flourishing?
Think of a thriving plant that has the right soil, water, and sunlight. For Aristotle, eudaimonia is the supreme good for humans. It is the state of a human being flourishing, fulfilling its highest potential over the course of a complete life.
And the mechanism to achieve this flourishing is virtue.
Yes. But his definition of virtue is really specific. It's not just a checklist of do not lie, do not steal.
Right.
For Aristotle, a virtue is not a rule. It is a deeply ingrained disposition. It is a habit of character. You don't become courageous by reading a book about courage. You become courageous by repeatedly performing courageous acts until it becomes second nature.
Virtue is human excellence, found in the golden mean between two extremes, like courage being the mean between cowardice and recklessness.
Exactly. And this framework, virtue ethics, is not just some relic of antiquity. It is highly active today.
Oh yeah, modern philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre have spearheaded a massive revival of virtue ethics, arguing that it's a much more realistic way to look at human morality than trying to be a perfect, logical, calculating machine.
Aristotle's focus on habits and character building feels intensely relevant today.
It's deeply pragmatic.
Yeah.
But as robust as this classical Greek framework was, it was about to encounter a historical force that would completely upend the Mediterranean world.
A major collision.
Right. We have this beautiful, logical architecture built by Plato and Aristotle. But then, a few centuries later, a cultural tsunami hits. The rise and absolute dominance of monotheistic religion, first Christianity, and later Islam.
And suddenly the entire paradigm shifts.
This creates an acute intellectual crisis. You have the rigorous logic, rational inquiry, and metaphysical frameworks bequeathed by the Greeks. But now you also have the theological, authoritative claims of monotheistic religion based on divine revelation.
The tension is obvious. What happens when human reason contradicts divine scripture?
Pop culture often paints this era, the medieval period, as the Dark Ages, where everyone just stopped thinking, burned the books, and blindly followed dogma.
That is a massive historical distortion. The medieval period was a time of highly sophisticated, painstakingly rigorous philosophical work.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. The challenge they faced was monumental: how to synthesize or reconcile the rational tools of Greek philosophy with the theological commitments of faith. They didn't abandon reason. They tried to build a bridge between reason and revelation.
It feels like they were trying a massive intellectual software update. They have this incredibly complex ancient Greek code, and they're trying to make it run smoothly on a brand new monotheistic operating system without crashing the whole computer.
That is a very apt description of the enterprise. And the first major architect of this synthesis was Augustine of Hippo in the 4th and 5th centuries.
Okay, what did he do?
Augustine's monumental achievement was the synthesis of Platonic philosophy with Christian theology.
How did he merge them? Plato was a pagan, talking about the realm of forms.
Augustine essentially Christianized the forms. He argued that Plato's eternal forms, the perfect concepts of goodness, justice, and truth, actually existed as thoughts within the infinite mind of God.
Oh, wow. That's a clever patch.
He took Plato's concept of the immortal soul and integrated it with Christian doctrines of free will, divine grace, and original sin.
And Augustine didn't just write dry theology. He wrote the Confessions, which is a wildly fascinating book. It's not just a religious text.
Not at all. The Confessions is widely considered one of the earliest autobiographical works in the Western tradition. It is a text of startling psychological depth.
He looks inward.
Yes, he turns his analytical gaze completely inward. He writes profoundly about the mystery of human memory, the subjective psychological experience of time passing, and the agonizing internal divisions of the human will.
He's investigating the inner life in a way that directly anticipates modern psychology and the philosophy of mind.
Exactly. So Augustine successfully merges Plato and Christianity.
But what about Aristotle? We talked about how different he was from Plato.
That synthesis had to weigh, primarily because Aristotle's major philosophical texts were largely lost to Western Europe for centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire.
But they weren't lost to the world.
No, they were preserved, intensely studied, commented upon, and translated by brilliant Arabic and Islamic scholars like Avicenna and Averroes.
And when those texts finally made their way back to Western Europe, translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, it caused a massive intellectual shockwave.
It was an academic earthquake. Suddenly, Western scholars were confronted with a comprehensive, brilliant, logically watertight system of understanding the entire physical world that made absolutely no reference to the Christian God.
It threatened to overturn the entire medieval worldview.
Enter Thomas Aquinas, the man who looks at this terrifyingly brilliant Aristotelian system and decides he's going to integrate it into the church.
Yes. In the 13th century, Aquinas undertook the Herculean task of synthesizing Aristotle's empirical, logical framework with Christian doctrine.
He believed that because God created both the world and human reason, true faith and true reason could never ultimately contradict each other.
This is where we get his famous 5 proofs for the existence of God. He isn't just saying believe because the Bible says so.
No, he is using Aristotelian logic arguments about motion, causation, and design to attempt a rational proof of God.
Precisely. And he utilized Aristotle's teleological view of nature to develop natural law theory in ethics, arguing that moral laws are woven into the very fabric of human nature by God and can be discovered by reason.
His synthesis, known as Thomism, was so successful that it eventually became, and largely remains, the official philosophical framework of the Catholic Church.
And what's wild is that by relentlessly using logic to debate these theological points, a tradition known as scholasticism, they were inadvertently sharpening the very tools of logical analysis that would eventually be used to spark the scientific revolution.
They built the logical infrastructure for modern science.
They absolutely did. But no matter how brilliantly Augustine and Aquinas built their syntheses, intellectual structures inevitably face stress.
Right.
Over the centuries, due to religious wars, the Protestant Reformation, and the early rumblings of the scientific revolution, the authority that held the medieval synthesis together began to fracture.
Thinkers realized they needed a new foundation for knowledge that didn't rely on religious authority or ancient texts.
They needed a complete reboot. The system was too corrupted with doubts. They needed a way to prove what was objectively true starting from scratch. And that brings us to the birth of modern philosophy in the 17th century.
The defining moment of this reboot occurs in 1641 with René Descartes and the publication of his Meditations on First Philosophy.
This is where it gets really fun.
Descartes looked at the intellectual chaos of his time, the shifting sands of what was considered true, and decided he needed an absolutely unshakable, indubitable foundation.
To find it, he employed a method of radical methodological skepticism. He essentially decides to doubt literally everything. He wants to see if anything survives the fire of ultimate doubt.
Right, he asks, can I trust my senses? Well, no, because sometimes I hallucinate or see a mirage. Can I be sure I'm sitting here by the fire? No, because I could be asleep and having a very vivid dream.
He pushes it to the absolute conceptual limit. He introduces the thought experiment of the evil demon.
Yes.
He imagines a supreme malicious entity whose entire purpose is to deceive him. What if this demon is feeding his mind a perfectly constructed illusion of reality? What if the sky, his body, other people, and even basic mathematics are just a grand deception planted in his mind?
It's the original Matrix concept. What if I'm just a brain in a vat? And if an evil demon is controlling everything I perceive, is there literally anything I can know for certain?
And at the very bottom of this abyss of doubt, Descartes finds his bedrock. He realizes that even if the demon is deceiving him about everything, there must be a him to be deceived.
The very act of doubting, the very occurrence of thought, is undeniable proof of the thinker's existence. He formulates the immortal phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
It's a breathtaking logical pivot. He strips the universe down to nothing, finds a single spark of certainty, his own mind, and then tries to rebuild reality back up from there.
But while it's a brilliant move, it creates a massive hangover that philosophy and science are still suffering from today.
Because of how he rebuilt reality.
Yes. In establishing the certainty of his mind separately from the physical world he had doubted, Descartes established the doctrine of substance dualism.
What does that mean?
He argued that reality is composed of two fundamentally distinct substances. The mind is a thinking substance. It is non-physical, has no weight, takes up no space, and is conscious. The body and the rest of the material world is an extended substance. It is purely physical, mechanical, and operates like clockwork.
By drawing that hard line, he created the permanent mind-body problem. Because if the mind is completely non-physical, a ghost, and the body is completely physical, a machine, how do they interact?
Exactly.
When my non-physical mind decides it wants coffee, how does it cause my physical arm to reach out and grab the mug?
It is the defining mystery. How does the ghost pull the levers of the machine? As we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive, this Cartesian dualism is the direct ancestor of the hard problem of consciousness.
Neuroscience can map the extended substance, the physical brain, but struggles to explain the thinking substance, the inner experience.
Precisely. So Descartes is operating on the European continent, relying heavily on pure logic and reason, a school of thought known as rationalism.
But over in England, thinkers are taking a radically different approach to how we acquire knowledge. Enter John Locke and the English empiricists.
If Descartes believed we could discover profound truths through pure, innate reason, independent of the physical world, Locke vehemently disagreed.
In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke argued against the existence of innate ideas. He posited that the human mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate.
We are born knowing absolutely nothing.
Correct. For Locke, every single piece of knowledge we possess, every concept, from the simplest idea of red to the most complex idea of a government, derives ultimately and entirely from sensory experience.
We observe the world, and our minds reflect on those observations. That is empiricism.
And Locke's influence wasn't just confined to theories about the mind. He took these ideas and applied them to politics, and the ripple effects changed the actual world map.
Quite literally. In his two treatises of government, Locke argued against the divine right of kings. If all humans are born as blank slates, equal in their basic nature, then political authority cannot be naturally ordained.
He articulated the theory of natural rights, that individuals possess inherent rights to life, liberty, and property.
Therefore, government is not a master, but an artificial construct created by the consent of the governed to protect those rights.
And if the government fails to protect those rights, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. If you've ever read the American Declaration of Independence, you're basically reading Thomas Jefferson plagiarizing John Locke.
The intellectual lineage is direct and undeniable. Empiricism proved to be a highly productive, liberating philosophy. But empiricism didn't stop with Locke.
A few decades later, a Scottish philosopher named David Hume took the premises of empiricism and radicalized them, driving them to a point of profound, almost terrifying skepticism.
Hume is the guy who brings the wrecking ball, because he looks at our reliance on sensory experience and uses it to attack the very foundation of science, the concept of cause and effect.
Hume asked a devastatingly simple question. When we claim that one thing causes another, where exactly in our sensory experience do we observe the causation?
Wait, let me push back on this. If I'm playing pool and I hit the cue ball into the 8-ball, the 8-ball rolls away. The cue ball hitting it clearly caused the 8-ball to move. I saw it happen.
Hume would ask you to look much closer at what you actually saw. You experienced event A, the physical movement of the white cue ball. Then you experienced event B, the physical movement of the black 8-ball.
Right.
But did you, with your eyes, actually see a physical force called causation passing between them? Did you see a magical invisible string connecting the two events?
Well, no, I just saw one thing hit and the other thing move.
Precisely. Hume argued that all we actually observe is what he called constant conjunction. Event A happens, and it is immediately followed by event B. Because we have seen this happen repeatedly in the past, our minds form a strong psychological habit of expecting B whenever we see A.
Hold on. So Hume is arguing that causation isn't an objective physical law of the universe. It's just a psychological trick our brains play on us. It's literally just classical conditioning, like Pavlov's dogs hearing a bell and salivating for food.
That is exactly his argument. We have no rational, logical justification for assuming that the future will resemble the past. We assume the sun will rise tomorrow because it always has, but we cannot rationally prove it must rise.
Wow.
Hume argued that our belief in cause and effect is based on custom and habit, not on unshakable rational certainty.
But if Hume is right, then science collapses. Science is entirely based on discovering the laws of cause and effect. If causation is just a mental habit, then physics is basically just a highly structured form of gambling.
And that realization sent shockwaves through the intellectual world. It woke the philosophical world from its dogmatic slumber, as the great Immanuel Kant famously put it.
Ah, Kant.
Kant realized the absolute crisis at hand. If Hume's skepticism held true, not only was philosophy dead, but the entire enterprise of science was completely unjustified.
Enter Kant to attempt the greatest rescue mission in the history of thought. In 1781, he publishes the Critique of Pure Reason. He looks at the rationalists who think reason is everything, and the empiricists who think experience is everything, and he tries to fuse them together.
Kant is the ultimate synthesizer. He agrees with the empiricists on one point. All our knowledge begins with sensory experience. But he argues vehemently against them by claiming that the mind is not a passive blank slate just receiving data.
Right. The human mind is an active processor.
How so?
Kant proposes what is known as transcendental idealism. He argues that concepts like space, time, and causation are not objects floating out there in the external universe waiting to be discovered. Rather, space, time, and causation are the built-in structural filters of the human mind.
They are the cognitive software that our brains actively impose on the raw, chaotic data of the universe in order to make it understandable.
Okay, let me try an analogy. It's as if every human being is born with a pair of rose-colored glasses permanently glued to their face. We look around and say, wow, the universe is pink.
But the universe isn't pink.
Right. The pinkness is a property of the lenses we're looking through. Kant is saying that time, space, and cause and effect are the lenses.
That is exactly right. Our minds actively construct the reality we experience, which leads to Kant's famous and somewhat haunting distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world.
The phenomenal world is the pink world.
Yes. The phenomenal world is a world exactly as it appears to us, filtered through our mental structures of space, time, and causality. Because our minds organize it, we can know this phenomenal world with absolute scientific certainty.
So science is safe.
Science is safe. But the noumenal world, the universe as it actually is in itself, independent of our human filters, is forever inaccessible to us. We can never take off the glasses.
That is mind-bending. He saved science, but the price was admitting that we never experienced true naked reality.
Exactly.
But Kant didn't stop at metaphysics. He also wanted to rebuild morality on a foundation of absolute rational certainty. No more relying on feelings or religion. He gives us the categorical imperative.
In his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Kant lays the foundation for deontological or duty-based ethics.
The most famous formulation of his categorical imperative is, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
Okay, let's stress test this with a real-world example for you listening. Say I'm running late, and I want to cut to the front of a very long line at the grocery store. I have a reason my time is valuable. How does Kant's rule apply?
Kant demands that you take the underlying principle of your action, your maxim, which is, I can cut the line if I am in a hurry, and universalize it. You must ask, would it be logically coherent if every single person in the world acted on this exact same rule?
Well, if everyone cut the line whenever they felt rushed, the entire structure of the line would instantly disintegrate. It would just be a chaotic mob.
Exactly. The action defeats its own purpose when universalized. Therefore, according to Kant, cutting the line is not just rude, it is deeply illogical and therefore immoral.
The morality of an action does not depend on the consequences. It depends entirely on the logical consistency of the rule behind it. You have a rational duty to obey the universal law.
But doesn't that get incredibly rigid? What if a murderer is at my door asking where my friend is hiding? Kant's logic says I can't lie, because if everyone lied, truth would lose all meaning. But if I tell the truth, my friend dies.
You have hit upon the classic objection to Kantian deontology. Kant was notoriously strict. He argued that you cannot control consequences, you can only control your adherence to rational duty. Lying is inherently a violation of rational law, regardless of the tragic outcome.
It's a brilliant, massive, rigid system. Kant effectively locked human understanding and morality inside the unyielding structures of rationality.
But as we move past Kant, the thinkers that follow him look at this massive architectural system and realize it has one glaring, fatal flaw.
Kant treated the human mind and its rational structures as completely static. He analyzed the mind as if it were outside of time. What he missed was the messy, evolutionary, transforming process of history.
And that realization kicks off the 19th century, where philosophy leaves the pristine realm of pure logic and gets incredibly dynamic, historical, and radical, the era of grand narratives.
And the man who brings history into philosophy is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
For Hegel, reality is not a static picture that we look at. It is an active historical process. He proposed a philosophy of absolute idealism. He argued that reality is the self-development of what he called absolute spirit, or Geist.
And this spirit moves through human history in stages, becoming increasingly self-conscious, complex, and rational over time.
History has a direction. It has a purpose. And the engine that drives history forward is conflict. This is Hegel's famous dialectical method.
Yes. Hegel observed that human progress does not happen in a straight, smooth line. It happens through opposition. A dominant idea or historical situation emerges the thesis.
But every thesis inherently contains contradictions or flaws, which inevitably generate an opposing force, the antithesis.
They clash.
They clash violently intellectually or physically, and out of the ashes of that conflict, a new reality emerges, the synthesis.
The synthesis resolves the tension by incorporating the best elements of both the thesis and the antithesis while discarding their flaws. And then this new synthesis becomes the new thesis, and the historical process begins all over again at a higher level.
It's a fascinating lens to view history through. You can look at political systems, art movements, or scientific revolutions through this thesis-antithesis-synthesis structure.
It was so compelling that a young philosopher named Karl Marx adopted this dialectical structure entirely. But Marx made a massive, world-altering adjustment.
Marx completely inverted Hegel. Hegel was an idealist. He believed the clash of abstract ideas was driving physical history. Marx, along with Friedrich Engels, was a materialist.
He famously stated that he found Hegel standing on his head and turned him right side up. This is the foundation of historical materialism.
So if Hegel's dialectic is a pendulum, swinging back and forth, driven by the invisible force of spirit and ideas, Marx says, no, the pendulum is made of iron and coal. It's driven by economics, factories, and who owns the land.
Exactly. To understand Marx impartially as a philosophical system, you must understand his structural argument. Marx argued that the foundational base of any society is its material, economic conditions, the mode of production.
Everything else, politics, law, religion, philosophy, art, is just a superstructure built on top to support the economic base.
For Marx, it wasn't the clash of abstract ideas driving history. It was the physical, material conflict between different economic classes competing for resources.
It's a structural framework that shifted the entire focus of social analysis from ideas to economics. But while Marx was analyzing the factories and the material conditions, another 19th century titan, Friedrich Nietzsche, decided to take a psychological sledgehammer to the entire moral foundation of Western civilization.
Nietzsche is unparalleled in his rhetorical power and his radicalism, and it is crucial to approach him carefully because he is frequently misunderstood.
When we look at his most famous declaration, God is dead, we must realize he was not primarily making a triumphant atheistic theological argument.
Right, he wasn't celebrating, he was terrified. He was offering a brutal cultural diagnosis.
Precisely. Nietzsche observed the rise of the Enlightenment, the success of the scientific revolution, and the creeping secularism of European culture. He recognized that while people still went to church, the deep foundational belief in the Christian God as the ultimate anchor for objective truth and morality had effectively evaporated.
The scaffolding of reality had been removed, but society hadn't noticed yet that the building was hanging in midair.
And Nietzsche thought the realization of this collapse would bring about the most dangerous psychological crisis in human history: nihilism. The terrifying suspicion that existence is entirely meaningless and there are no objective moral facts.
And in the face of this impending nihilism, Nietzsche believed humanity needed a massive revaluation of all values. He launched a blistering, devastating critique of conventional Judeo-Christian morality. He labeled it a slave morality.
What does he mean by that?
He argued that historical Christianity had inverted natural human values. It took traits associated with weakness, submission, poverty, and pity, and elevated them to the status of ultimate virtues.
Simultaneously, it demonized strength, ambition, excellence, and earthly power as sinful. For Nietzsche, this was a profoundly sick, anti-life philosophy that suppressed human greatness.
In its place, he championed the will to power, the fundamental, driving biological and psychological force of all life to expand, grow, and assert its strength.
And to test whether a person could truly overcome nihilism and embrace life, he proposed the ultimate thought experiment, the eternal recurrence.
It is a staggering psychological challenge. Imagine a demon creeps into your loneliest loneliness and tells you that this exact life you are living right now, every pain, every joy, every mundane moment, every deep dive conversation, you will have to live over and over again in the exact same sequence for all eternity.
It's horrifying. Most people look back at their lives with deep regrets or trauma they never want to experience again.
Exactly. If that thought crushes you, you are still bound by regret and resentment. But if you could hear that demonic prophecy and enthusiastically say yes, if you could love your fate so deeply that you actively will its eternal repetition, then you have achieved true greatness. You have affirmed life completely.
It's an intoxicating, overwhelming philosophy. But while Nietzsche was on the continent, tearing down conventional morality with poetic fury, back in England, thinkers were taking a much more practical, systematic approach to the moral void.
We get the rise of utilitarianism with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
If Nietzsche was the poet of radical individualism, the utilitarians were the engineers of social policy. They sought a scientific, measurable foundation for morality. The core doctrine of utilitarianism is deeply intuitive. The morally right action is the one that produces the greatest amount of overall happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people.
It's consequentialism. The rules don't matter, only the outcomes. Bentham formulated it as a literal calculus. He thought you could assign numerical values to the intensity and duration of pleasure and pain, add them up, and objectively solve moral dilemmas.
But John Stuart Mill, who was raised as a strict Benthamite, realized that a pure quantitative calculus was too crude. It could theoretically justify terrible things if it made a large majority slightly happy. So Mill added crucial qualitative nuance.
Right. Mill argued there is difference between higher and lower pleasures. He famously said, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied."
The intellectual, emotional pleasure of reading great literature or connecting with a friend is qualitatively superior to the sheer physical pleasure of eating a huge meal.
Mill's refinement of utilitarianism and his fierce defense of individual freedom in his essay on liberty laid the groundwork for modern liberal democracies.
And utilitarianism isn't just theory. It is the invisible engine running the modern world. Whenever a government does a complex cost-benefit analysis to decide whether to fund a new hospital or a new highway, they are doing utilitarian calculus.
Even the modern effective altruism movement, where people try to calculate exactly how to do the most mathematical good with their charitable donations, is a direct descendant of Bentham and Mill.
They provided the practical toolkit. But if we step back and look at the end of the 19th century, we see an explosion of massive, conflicting grand narratives.
Hegel's absolute spirit, Marx's historical materialism, Nietzsche's radical revaluation, utilitarian calculus. Philosophy had expanded in so many different contradictory directions that the discipline essentially fractured.
It broke. Which brings us to the 20th century schism. This is where the story gets really dramatic from an academic perspective, because philosophy literally splits into two deeply opposed camps, and for decades they essentially refused to even speak to each other.
We get the analytic tradition and the continental tradition.
It was a profound structural split, rooted in both geography and deeply opposed methodologies. Let's examine the analytic tradition first, which came to dominate the universities of the UK, the US, and the English-speaking world.
The analytic thinkers were exhausted by the grand, sweeping, unprovable speculations of the 19th century.
They looked at Hegel talking about absolute spirit and essentially said, "This is meaningless poetry. We need to be like scientists."
Precisely. Tracing their lineage from thinkers like Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell to the logical positivism of the Vienna Circle, the analytic philosophers became obsessed with formal logic, mathematics, and extreme conceptual clarity.
They believed that philosophical problems weren't deep mysteries of the universe. They were often just confusions caused by imprecise language. Their goal was to use mathematical logic to map language perfectly to reality.
And the absolute central, almost mythic figure in this tradition is Ludwig Wittgenstein. And what is so incredible about Wittgenstein is that he was so brilliant, he basically invented two completely different versions of analytic philosophy in a single lifetime.
He is a unique figure in intellectual history. His early work, a dense, cryptic book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, proposed the picture theory of language. He argued that language functions by creating logical pictures of facts in the physical world.
If a sentence does not picture a verifiable empirical fact, it is literally meaningless nonsense.
So if I say the cat is on the mat, that has meaning because I can verify the physical fact. But if I say murder is objectively evil, Wittgenstein would say what?
In his early phase, he would argue that ethical statements, aesthetic judgments, and religious claims do not picture verifiable facts. Therefore, they are outside the bounds of logical language. They are meaningless in a strict logical sense.
He thought he had solved all of philosophy with this framework and literally quit philosophy to become a schoolteacher.
But then he realizes he was wrong. He comes back to Cambridge and later in his life publishes the Philosophical Investigations, where he completely dismantles his own earlier theory.
He executes a radical pivot. He realizes that language is not a rigid logical picture of facts. Language is a social tool. He introduces the concept of language games.
The meaning of a word is not found in the object it points to. The meaning of a word is defined entirely by how it is used within a specific social context or game.
Give me an example of a language game.
Take the word game itself. Try to find one single defining feature that applies to all games. Board games have winners and losers, but throwing a ball against a wall doesn't. Chess requires extreme skill, but a slot machine is pure luck.
There is no single logical essence of a game. There is only a complex web of family resemblances.
So words are flexible, they shift depending on the context. And this leads Wittgenstein to a totally different view of what philosophy is. It's not about building logical systems, it's linguistic therapy.
Yes, a deflationary approach.
Yeah.
Philosophy is not about solving profound mysteries. It's about untangling the knots in our language that make us think there are mysteries. As he put it, the philosopher's goal is to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle.
Okay, so that's the analytic side, obsessed with logic, language, and conceptual clarity, the IT department of human thought. But across the English Channel, the continental tradition dominant in France and Germany was doing something completely different.
The continental thinkers looked at the analytic obsession with formal logic and found it entirely disconnected from what actually matters. They weren't interested in mathematically analyzing sentences. They were obsessed with the raw, lived reality of human experience, culture, politics, and power.
This is where the real drama and angst live. We get phenomenology with Edmund Husserl, trying to rigorously describe conscious experience from the inside out.
We get Martin Heidegger undertaking fundamental ontology, trying to answer the absolute deepest question possible: what does it actually mean to be in the first place?
And then we get the movement that bled out of the universities and into the jazz clubs and cafes, existentialism.
Existentialism, championed by figures like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Simone de Beauvoir, captured the post-war European mood perfectly. Sartre articulated the core doctrine of existentialism with the phrase, "Existence precedes essence."
Okay, let's break that down because it's a massive concept. What does existence precedes essence actually mean in practice?
Sartre contrasts a human being with a manufactured object, like a paper knife. Before a paper knife is created, the artisan conceives of its essence, its design, its purpose to cut paper. For the paper knife, essence precedes existence. It has a built-in purpose.
But for humans?
Sartre, writing from an atheistic perspective, argued that there is no divine artisan. There is no pre-given human nature, no inherent purpose, no script we're supposed to follow. We simply exist first.
We show up in the world thrown into existence without a manual, and therefore we must define our own essence entirely through our actions and choices.
We are, as he famously put it, condemned to be free, which sounds liberating but is actually terrifying. If I have radical freedom, I have radical, inescapable responsibility for exactly who I become. I can't blame human nature. I can't blame God. I can't blame my parents.
It is a philosophy of immense weight. And the continental tradition continued to generate these massive frameworks for understanding human culture. We get the Frankfurt School thinkers like Adorno, Horkheimer, and Habermas developing critical theory to analyze how mass culture and capitalism manipulate consciousness.
We get structuralism with figures like Saussure and Lévi-Strauss analyzing the underlying hidden structures of language and myth.
And then the post-structuralists come in and tear their structures down. Thinkers like Jacques Derrida deconstructing texts, or Michel Foucault. Foucault is fascinating because he analyzes how language isn't just about meaning, it's a mechanism of power.
Foucault's work is incredibly influential today. He looked at how historical epochs define concepts like madness or criminality or sexuality. He argued that these definitions are not objective scientific discoveries. They are constructs created by the institutions in power, the asylum, the prison, the clinic, to categorize, control, and discipline populations. Knowledge and power are inextricably linked.
I listened to the goals of the analytic thinkers and the goals of the continental thinkers, and I have to ask, why on earth didn't they just talk to each other? It sounds like the analytic philosophers were trying to debug the code of human language, while the continental philosophers were writing tragic poetry about the human condition in the dark. Both seem useful.
It is a humorous framing, but their underlying assumptions about the purpose of philosophy were simply incompatible for a long time. The IT department, as you called them, demanded truth that could be objectively verified and clarified. The poetry department demanded meaning that could be lived and felt. The good news is that in the 21st century, the strict walls between these traditions are finally starting to break down.
Which is necessary, because whether you are doing mathematical logic or analyzing existential dread, philosophy eventually has to come out of the clouds and answer a very urgent, practical question. How do we actually live together? How do we build a society? This brings us to ethics and political philosophy.
This is the branch of philosophy with the most immediate, concrete, real-world consequences. We've already explored the three massive historical frameworks battling for supremacy: consequentialism focusing on outcomes, deontology focusing on rational rules, and virtue ethics focusing on character.
In the 20th century, philosophers applied these frameworks to the massive, complex political and social issues of the modern era.
And when it comes to political philosophy in the 20th century, one figure towers above the rest: John Rawls. In 1971, he published A Theory of Justice, and he set out to solve a massive problem. How do you design a society that is genuinely fair when everyone inherently favors their own interests?
Rawls realized that if you ask a rich man to design tax policy, he will design a system that favors the rich. If you ask a majority group to design civil rights laws, they will favor the majority. To bypass this inherent bias, Rawls constructed what is arguably the most brilliant and influential thought experiment in modern political philosophy, the original position behind a veil of ignorance.
Let's play this game right now. I want you, the listener, to actively imagine this. You are part of a committee tasked with designing the complete structure, the laws, the educational system, and the economy of a brand new society. But you have to design it while standing behind a veil of ignorance.
The veil hides all information about who you will be in this new society once the veil is lifted. You do not know your race. You do not know your gender. You do not know your level of intelligence, your physical health, your sexual orientation, or your religious beliefs.
You could be born as the billionaire CEO of a tech company, or you could be born with a severe physical disability into the poorest neighborhood in the country. You have absolutely no idea what your spawn conditions will be. Knowing that you could be anyone, how would you structure the rules of the game?
Rawls forcefully argued that any fully rational, self-interested person in that original position would be forced to design a fair society, simply to protect themselves against the worst-case scenario. From behind the veil, Rawls deduces two fundamental principles of justice.
The first principle is about liberty, right?
The principle of equal basic liberties. Behind the veil, you would absolutely guarantee maximum freedom of speech, religion, and assembly for everyone. Why? Because you would never design a society that persecutes religious minorities, simply because you might wake up and find yourself in that minority. You guarantee equal rights as an insurance policy.
That makes perfect logical sense. But it's his second principle regarding the economy that really sparked the debates.
The difference principle? The difference principle addresses economic inequality. Rawls recognized that complete forced economic equality is inefficient. But behind the veil, you wouldn't want extreme, crushing poverty either. So Rawls argued that inequalities in wealth and power are only just if they work to the maximum benefit of the least advantaged members of society.
So society might agree to let doctors get paid significantly more than other professions, creating an inequality. But that inequality is justified because the high salary incentivizes talented people to undergo years of grueling medical training, which ensures there are enough skilled doctors to treat the poorest and sickest people in society. The inequality benefits the bottom.
Exactly. Rawls demonstrated impartially that political philosophy could be as rigorous, systematic, and logical as the analytic tradition demanded. His work profoundly shaped liberal political theory and provided a complex framework for debates around wealth redistribution that we still use today.
But political philosophy deals with the structure of society. What about our individual moral obligations? That brings us to Peter Singer, who takes consequentialism, specifically utilitarianism, and pushes it to its absolute, unforgiving logical limits.
Singer is perhaps the most famous living philosopher of applied ethics. He doesn't just theorize, he demands action. His work operates on a strict utilitarian calculus. We must minimize suffering and maximize well-being. And crucially, he argues for the moral equivalence of all sentient beings.
Meaning, if a being has the capacity to suffer, its suffering must be factored equally into our moral math. This is the foundation of his incredibly influential push for animal liberation. He argues that the suffering of an animal on a factory farm is a moral atrocity that we cannot justify simply because we like the taste of meat.
But his arguments regarding our obligations to other human beings are even more demanding. Singer uses a famous, deceptively simple analogy. Imagine you are walking past a shallow pond wearing a very expensive pair of shoes. You see a small child drowning in the pond. You can easily wade in and save the child, but doing so will completely ruin your expensive shoes. Are you morally obligated to save the child?
Of course. Anyone would say yes. Ruining a pair of shoes is nothing compared to the value of a human life. If you walked past, you'd be a monster.
Every sane person agrees with that premise. But Singer then springs the logical trap. Right now, in the real world, children are dying of preventable diseases like malaria or starvation. And right now, you have the money you would spend on luxuries, like a new pair of shoes, a video game, or an expensive coffee that could be donated to highly effective charities to literally save those lives.
He argues there is no moral difference between the child in the pond in front of you and the child starving across the globe. Distance doesn't change the moral math.
Exactly. Singer argues that if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, we are morally obligated to do it. Therefore, buying a luxury item when that exact same money could save a life is, in his utilitarian framework, morally indefensible.
Okay, I have to step in and push back on this, because Singer's math is logically flawless. On paper, it is a perfect argument. But isn't it impossibly demanding for an actual flawed, emotional human being to live by? It feels like his philosophy asks us to be unfeeling calculators. It ignores the fact that I have local attachments. I care more about my family, my friends, my community, than a stranger 1,000 miles away. Is it truly immoral to buy my child a birthday present instead of donating that money?
You have articulated the exact, sustained philosophical criticism leveled against strict consequentialism. Critics argue that Singer's framework fails to account for the special moral obligations we have based on relationships. They argue it turns morality into an exhausting, endless calculation that leaves no room for personal projects or simple joys. It demands moral perfection, which may be incompatible with human psychology.
But the very fact that we can have this debate, that we can pull apart Singer's logic or Rawls's veil of ignorance, relies on having the right tools. If you want to successfully navigate these high-stakes ethical debates, you need precision. And that leads us to our final component today, the vocabulary.
Philosophy provides the ultimate toolkit for clear thinking. Studying philosophical English is incredibly rewarding precisely because it represents the most rigorous, demanding register of the language. In everyday conversation, words are loosely expressive. We say things like, "I have a theory about why the movie ended that way." But in philosophy, precise meaning constitutes the argument.
Learning these terms is like upgrading from a butter knife to a surgical scalpel. You're no longer just slashing wildly at someone's opinion. You have the precise tools to dissect their logic, find the flaw, and articulate your own position perfectly. So let's walk through the foundational vocabulary, much of which derives from precise Greek and Latin roots.
We must begin by defining the core domains of inquiry we've been discussing. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, asking how we know what we claim to know and what justifies our beliefs. Metaphysics is the broad study of the fundamental nature of reality, transcending the physical sciences.
And within metaphysics, you have ontology, which is the specific study of being itself, what entities actually exist, and how they are categorized. And the method we use to debate these things, like we saw with Socrates and Hegel, is dialectic. It is the process of arriving at truth through the rigorous exchange of logical arguments, often involving the resolution of opposing views.
Moving to the architecture of logic, we have the syllogism. This is a formal deductive argument containing a major premise, a minor premise, and a necessary conclusion. The classic example: all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. If the premises are true, the conclusion cannot logically be false.
Then we have the great historical divide in how we get our premises. Empiricism is the epistemological stance that all knowledge is ultimately derived from sensory experience. Contrasted with rationalism, the stance that reason itself is the primary source of knowledge, independent of sensory input.
Now consider how we experience the world. Determinism is the philosophical doctrine that every event, including every human decision and action, is the inevitable and necessary consequence of antecedent states of affairs. In short, cause and effect rule everything, posing a massive challenge to the concept of free will. Phenomenology, as we saw in the continental tradition, is the rigorous first-person study of the structures of subjective conscious experience.
And when making claims, we have to use the right modalities. A categorical statement, like Kant's imperative, is absolute, unconditional, and admits no exceptions. A contingent truth is something that happens to be true in our current reality, but could conceivably have been false. For example, the sky is blue is a contingent truth.
Exactly. It could have been read under different atmospheric conditions. But a necessary truth is a proposition that must be true in all possible worlds, and its denial entails a logical contradiction. For example, the mathematical statement 2 plus 2 equals 4, or the logical statement a bachelor is an unmarried man.
Finally, we need the terminology for how we acquire and process evidence. A priori knowledge is knowledge that is justified independently of experience, relying purely on reason, like knowing that all triangles have 3 sides. You don't need to examine every triangle in the universe to know that. A posteriori knowledge is dependent entirely on empirical evidence and observation, like knowing that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius.
And the cognitive processes themselves. Inductive reasoning moves from specific empirical observations to broader generalizations, dealing in probabilities. Science relies heavily on induction. Deductive reasoning, however, moves from general logical premises to a specific, absolutely certain conclusion, dealing in logical necessity.
It is a dense toolkit, but mastering these precise definitions is the absolute prerequisite for engaging with complex thought. And it's not just about the individual vocabulary words, it's about mastering the argumentative structure itself, the rhetorical moves.
That is a crucial point. Careful, rigorous academic argumentation relies on a very specific structural template. It is not about shouting your opinion louder. It involves carefully stating a position, laying out a structured sequence of supporting reasons, and most importantly, actively anticipating and neutralizing opposing viewpoints.
This is where you see phrases like, one might object that, or it could be argued that. When you use those phrases, you're doing something incredibly powerful. You aren't hiding from the weakness in your argument. You are dragging the counter-argument out into the light, acknowledging it, and then systematically dismantling it. It demonstrates intellectual confidence.
Similarly, phrases like, to the extent that, or it is important to distinguish between, these are tools of calibration. You aren't making sweeping, easily refutable generalizations. You are drawing precise intellectual boundaries. You're showing the audience that you understand nuance.
Mastering this highly specific register of English does far more than just make you a better reader of philosophy. It cultivates an elite, highly transferable cognitive competence. The ability to structure a complex argument, accurately define your terms, anticipate counterattacks, and communicate abstract concepts clearly is an incredibly rare skill. It is immensely valued in law, in executive leadership, in high-level programming, and in academic contexts worldwide.
It is the ultimate intellectual training ground. We have covered an immense expanse of human thought today.
We really have. We've gone from the ancient shores of Greece to modern boardrooms.
To summarize this massive historical journey, we began with the cosmological inquiries of the pre-Socratics, moved through the soaring metaphysical forms of Plato and the rigorous empirical categories of Aristotle. We saw the profound synthesis of reason and faith by the medieval theologians, followed by the radical, foundation-shaking skepticism of Descartes. We explored the historical, dynamic turn of the 19th century with Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche, navigated the deep linguistic and existential schisms of the 20th century, and finally applied these tools to the urgent ethical dilemmas of Rawls and Singer. Philosophy is undeniably the indispensable operating system of human thought. Science will continue to provide an ever-growing, magnificent mountain of empirical data, but philosophy provides the critical framework required to organize, interpret, and derive actual meaning from that data.
Science is the engine, but philosophy is the destination. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We began this conversation by asking if the triumphs of modern science had made philosophy obsolete. The answer we found is a resounding no. But think about the very near future. If philosophy is the discipline designed to ask the profound questions that science cannot answer, what entirely new philosophical emergencies will our current technological revolution force upon us? Specifically, the explosive rise of artificial intelligence. When a machine made of silicon can perfectly mimic human reason, write poetry, and convincingly simulate empathy, what entirely new questions will we be forced to ask about what it actually means to be a human being? When the machine talks back, where does the human soul reside?
That is a profoundly necessary, terrifying, and exciting question for the 21st century. Philosophy is just getting started. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep questioning your assumptions, keep sharpening those intellectual tools, and we'll see you next time.